That, yeah, you're supposed to have a test for this, right? And to make it as hard as possible, no, is what they told me, no. But you do have to do an evaluation for this class. So just briefly to talk about what I think it's going to be. On Thursday, there'll be the evaluation. It'll probably be about 50 questions, multiple choice. It'll be mainly give or take. If that's the case, it'll be 2 points each. I think passing is, what they say, 35 or 40, somewhere around there, but we'll double check. And it'll be things that we cover in this class. It won't be anything that, little tiny details. It really will just make sure that you understand the general ideas from this class. It'll be a bit more sort of applied thought. So it'll be some questions that are, which of the following are characteristics of human rights? What we talked about yesterday, right? Like non-discriminatory and so on. But then there'll also be a few little hypotheticals, and it'll ask you, how would the court rule in Europe? And based on what you know, and based on what we talked about, you'll need to choose. They would rule for the petitioner or against the petitioner. You understand? So that's the idea. It won't be anything more than that. On Tuesday, which will be our final class before the evaluation, we can go over a few practice questions, just so you have an idea for what it's going to be. But it's not going to be anything that's going to trick you, that's going to make you crazy. I think it's a nice test. So anyway, we'll talk about it a little more, yeah? Any questions from yesterday? Any? No question. No. How many of you have books? Okay, so about 90% or so of you. Okay, good. All right, well that is good. So here's the plan. What we're going to do today is we're going to continue talking about the United Nations systems. We'll look specifically at the different functions of the United Nations to how they enforce human rights. Yeah. So we'll look at, we've talked about these treaties, but things on paper are nice. What we need, obviously, is enforcement mechanisms. So we'll look at what the enforcement mechanisms are. We'll critique them, yeah, and we'll then go and we'll have some discussion about that, yeah. I'll also show you a bit on basic aspects, just very basic, because we don't have that much time, of legal research, yeah. How do we research in the human rights field? We'll take a look at one of the websites of the United Nations. We'll look at, they have jurisprudence and what are called general comments. We'll just look a little bit at that. And then what we'll do is we'll, in your books, we have 2 exercises that I want to do today. And we'll do those 2 exercises, yeah? And then after that, we'll talk about human rights generally from an African point of view, from a European point of view, and then from a American point of view. American being all of the Americas, Latin America and the United States, and technically Canada, but Canada's perfect. So that's the plan. And then tomorrow we'll spend the whole day doing the entire unit of freedom of expression, and we'll see how human rights are implemented quite differently depending on the jurisdiction. Even though we have freedom of expression, it varies considerably, and I think I think it's quite interesting to look at freedom of expression and how it intersects with culture, with history, and so on. Okay, so that's what we'll do, and then Sunday you're free. Yeah. So yeah, there's no obligations for Sunday. You can read. You spend all your day reading. All right. So okay. So let's talk then about so we left off yesterday talking about the major frameworks, right? We looked at a bit about what's in the Universal Declaration, the Convention, and so on. So the question is then, how are these human rights monitored, right? How do we make sure that countries actually meet their obligations? We have, for each individual treaty, we have a corresponding committee, right? Who is on the committee? The committee is made up of experts in that field, right? So we have academics, former judges, lawyers, policymakers from different countries that are on this committee. There's the Human Rights Committee, which ensures the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural, Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, of racial discrimination, which actually is another treaty. Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Committee Against Torture, Rights of the Child, Committee on Migrant Workers, and then, as I said yesterday, also one for disabled people, right? So those are the different committees that exist, made up of experts, and they have a number of important functions, right? The first important function is that they receive complaints from individuals of signatory countries. Everyone understand that? So a signatory to the convention, in most cases, the individuals who reside in their country can make a complaint to that committee, right?
Directly?
Directly, yes. Yeah, directly. Yeah. They can make a complaint directly to the committee. What do you mean, as opposed to?
No, I mean, there's a system, you know, we lodge complaints and there's a hierarchy and there are courts and every country has its domestic system of judicial.
Yeah. So, okay, I see what you're saying. In other courts, for example, in the European court, you're required to exhaust all your remedies. We'll talk about that. That is the case. It's sort of complementarity in a way. In the case of most of these, you can make, ideally you want to exhaust all your remedies, but it's not specifically required that you exhaust all your remedies. Because it's not a court. It's a complaint mechanism, which is different, right? When we look at the Inter-American Court, the European Court, the African Court, then it's a court of last resort. But in this case, it's a complaint mechanism, right? So one of the things that they can do is receive complaints from the individuals in a country. In most cases, the way it works out, I think as she correctly pointed out, is it's individuals who have exhausted all their remedies. But it's not an absolute requirement to exhaust all your remedies, right? Now, what that committee can do then is investigate the complaint and then seek to work with the country and the individual to come up with a resolution. These resolutions, or these decisions as they're called, they're non-binding, right? Because it's not a judicial administrative court. Everyone understand that? Right? It's a mechanism to try and seek some resolution, to tell the state that you have to improve your water sources. You should give this person some sort of remedy. But it's not a court, so it doesn't have the judicial powers of a court that binds the system. So that's the first, is it reviews complaints, yeah? The other big thing that it does is it creates what are called general comments, yeah? General comments are specifications on the law, meaning it tells us in great detail what exactly the law means. Everyone understand that? So if we look, for example, I'll show you an example. So if we go to, this is for the Economic, Social, and Cultural Committee. You can go to their website through Google, Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Sorry. Out of the page you have what's called general comments, yeah? And with that, state lawyer, right? That would be ideal, or in a law firm, wherever you want to go, but that's obviously not what the right to work means. Same thing, for example, everyone has the right to take part in cultural life. Fine. This one, everyone has the right to Social Security. So that's what the convention tells us, right? We have the right to Social Security. We have the right to work. But it doesn't really tell us very much more than that, the convention itself. So what we need to do is consult the general comments, right? And if we look, for example, at, let's say, the right to Social Security. So we click on it. Hindi is not an option, no? No. Okay. The next best thing, English, no? We'll look at English. Come on in, it's okay. Yeah, of course. How you doing? Good. Welcome. Okay. Okay, and what we get here are general comments. And the committee, these experts, develop the general comments. This here, for example, on the Committee on the Rights of the Child, there's a Spaniard on it. And he's been working, for example, to elaborate the general comments on, on street children, for example. There's a new general comment about children on the street. So again, what that does is it takes a look at all of the types of problems, all of the issues, all of the complaints that have come through, and it creates these general comments. And that's a way for states, when they're implementing the law, when they're abiding by the law, when they're fulfilling, respecting, protecting, they know exactly what to do. Everyone understand that? So if we look here, for example, it's about, how many pages is it? 21 pages. All right, thank you. It tells us exactly, let's see, elements of the right to work. So availability, right? Again, it's not super specific. You have to pay this amount of money, but it tells us the key components. Availability. Social risk and contingencies. It has to deal with that. It has to deal with health care. It has to deal with sickness, old age, unemployment, employment injury, family and child support, and maternity. And a few more. Disability, survivors, orphans. Okay? So that's the first element, right? Any system of Social Security has to offer all of those. Now, we know that not every system in the world does, but nevertheless, according to the general comments, that is the obligation of the state. What else? It has to be adequate, right? Again, it doesn't tell us how much is adequate, but it tells us must be adequate in amount and duration in order that everyone may realize his or her rights to family protection and assistance in adequate standard of health care, right? So what we can also see is the interdependency that it tells us here, right? That it's not only right to Social Security, but that right to Social Security links to other rights, which is also in this convention. Sorry? Which one? Who's that?
To certain standard. To educate level of a certain standard.
Adequate standard of living, right? Yeah, precisely, exactly. It has to meet the condition of adequate standard of living. If we violate Social Security, then we also violate the adequate standard of living. Everyone follow that? And we might also violate education and so on and so on. So that's another element of it. Accessibility. It has to be accessible. All persons should be covered. What does this mean? This means people in the formal sector, but also, if you read through it more, in the informal sector, right? India, for example, has a big informal sector, right? People who are working on the streets, for example, oftentimes are informal workers. No, is that the case here? No? Technically, they should be covered. I don't know, are they here in India covered generally by Social Security?
We don't have much of a Social Security.
Okay, fine. Okay, that's the case in most countries.
We have certain schemes, of course. There are welfare schemes, but it is not covered in that.
Unorganized sector.
Okay, so it's that idea. In theory, it should be everyone, right? What did I do? But anyway, it goes through all these conditions. If we think about water, for example, we can also pull up the general comments to water, right? Similar idea. Water, it's not just that it's any water, but it has to be accessible water. It has to be of a certain quality. It has to be of a certain color. It has to look like water, not like something that's been floating, which is what a lot of the world, most of the world still doesn't have access to clean water, or a good portion at least. It has to be, again, quality, accessibility, and there's also part of it, what's interesting is part of the right to water, according to general comments, links to right to information. That you have to have information about how to get water, right? So anyway, all of that is part of the right to water. Similarly, right to food, it tells us accessibility, affordability, quality, etc., etc. If we think about, right to health care, for example, under CEDAW, again, it tells us, the state, what women should have, right? So general comments are an essential part of understanding the law. We'll do an exercise with some sort of general comments in a moment, yeah? But it's an essential aspect of it, yeah? Finally, the third major function. So we have, one is it can receive complaints. Two, it produces general comments. And then the third is every country that is a signatory to the convention goes up for a periodic review. Everyone understand that? Yeah. So every country gets reviewed. So if we go, for example, so every country that has its review, I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so if we look here, this is the research component. So if we look at, for example, on the right side, so before we looked at the left side, on the left side is where we have, again, we have our recent jurisprudence, which are the complaints, yeah? Again, they call it jurisprudence, but it's really complaints. Here you can find statistical information on complaints. There's a database, so if you want to look through it for questions of water rights or food rights, you can find it there, yeah? And then on the right side, we have information about the reporting procedures, right? So if we want to find, for example, let's see, we can go to calendar of review. So this tells us which countries are up for review, right? Again, they take somewhere between 3 or 4 years. Some countries just don't show up. Israel, for example, oftentimes doesn't show up to review, but it should. And that's one of the big problems with the United Nations, is that if it doesn't, what can the United Nations do, right? It has limits to what it can do to enforce. But, so if we look here, okay, Angola, for example.
We don't show because these are not binding. That's the reason.
Well, they're technically binding. The problem is the enforcement mechanism is the problem. You're telling me it's not binding, or you're asking? Oh, okay. Yeah. No, it's not. It's non-binding. Well, in what sense do you mean?
The implementation of the policy.
I mean, it's binding in the sense that countries are supposed to comply, right? It's non-binding in the sense that if they don't comply,
there's no what if. There's no what if they don't. So it's ultimately, at the end of the day, it's only persuasive.
Exactly. Yeah. It's binding up to the point that they're willing to abide by it. Is the answer, right? That is sorry.
I'm saying it's at the discretion of the states.
Yeah, technically as states, I mean, they have a legal obligation, right? Because they've signed on to the treaty, right? So the legal obligation is there.
So mostly in cases of People's Republic of China also, they do not accept Reuters reports and everything.
Yeah, I mean, China also hasn't signed that many, hasn't signed all the treaties. And the United States is an example as well, right? I mean, it's the same issue. Why doesn't, the United States goes through it, but they don't often follow it, right? So at the end of the day, it's very much up to the state to determine whether or not they're going to follow it. Yeah.
So if the same country and it comes up for review for the second time and they haven't complied with the recommendations, then are they supposed to show cause as to why they didn't comply?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, what they oftentimes say is that they're working on it.
There's a contradiction between this sovereignty idea, no? That
Yeah.
sovereignty with the state lies with the state.
Yeah, and that is the overarching problem, right, with human rights, is that there's states maintain sovereignty. They cede some sovereignty to the United Nations, but at the end of the day, unless a state is committing a genocide or crimes against humanity, the ability of the United Nations is limited, right, if they don't comply. I mean, oftentimes what will happen is there'll be a press release, the Secretary General will send a letter. Publicly, they could publish that Rwanda isn't complying with its obligations, but beyond that, it's limited. But anyway, so just to show you, so we have these different countries that are up for review. You can see here. Sorry, it's not working that well. I don't know why. Okay. Anyway, it's up for review. How does a review process work? So a review process is circular. So what first happens with the review process is that the committee will provide a number of questions to the individual states, right? Questions concerning their compliance with that treaty. So if you've signed every treaty, you go up for review to every treaty. Everyone follow that? And it's basically the same process. It starts out with submission of questions, yeah? That is, questions are provided to the state. They then submit their answers, and then they testify. Yeah, they come in, there's a few days of testimony, where the state will testify and receive questions back from the committee. Yeah? This happens either in Geneva or in New York. Yeah? Wherever the committee is meeting. After that, the committee allows the submission of a shadow report. Anyone know what a shadow report is? A shadow report is a report that's provided by certain accredited NGOs. I worked some years ago on a shadow report for Seychelles. It was beautiful beaches, basically, was the thing. No, but so I was working for an NGO in New York, and Seychelles was going up for review under CEDAW, right? Under the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So they were going to testify, and they had submitted their report. So we also submitted our report based on our own investigation. Why do you think they do that? Why do you think they allow for a state report, but then also a shadow report?
To make sure.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, because oftentimes states will take a look. We'll do an exercise also today on how it works. But oftentimes the states will say, things are great, we're putting things in progress. They give us very vague information. We've created a commission against torture. And that's what they'll say. Tell us what they've done, right? So it oftentimes depends a lot on the United Nations, on the shadow reports to provide a counterbalance, right? After all of that is reviewed, again, we're going in a circle, then on the bottom of the circle, so we have questions, responses by both. Bottom, we have what's called concluding observations. And that is where the committee provides its information. What are concluding observations? What are there? This you're doing well. We commend you on your new law against domestic violence. But in the next round, we need more information about what you're doing, about number of prosecutions, or so they'll give their observations, yeah. And with that, they give suggestions, right? Sometimes it's compliments, sometimes it's suggestions, sometimes it's saying you haven't done this well. No. Once that's finished, the United Nations, through its circular process, will generally offer technical assistance. That is, through its individual agencies, right? UNDP, UN Women, UN AIDS, UN UNICEF, for example. They'll provide support to the country to help them remedy the deficiencies in their human rights protection. Everyone understand that? I was just there about 3 weeks ago. I was doing some work for UNICEF in Angola. Yeah, and that's partly because of this review process, right? The review process identified a number of deficiencies in the Angolan juvenile justice system. Problems with prosecutions, problems with judges. So I've gone there the last 2 years. I've been there now, I've been going 3 or 4 times, and I've been running trainings for their judges and their prosecutors precisely on these questions of, how do we implement correctly the Convention on the Rights of the Child, right, within the judicial system. And there were a few of us that were going. And for example, I did a talk on stereotyping, right? Because one of the big problems that's noted is the stereotyping in the judicial system against female minors. What do I mean by that? I started off last time by saying to, he was a prosecutor, this is recorded, no? But it won't be too public. Is it public to anyone? I just don't want to get anyone in trouble here. But anyway, okay.
You want to have a relook on what you said?
No, it's okay, I can. So I was talking to a prosecutor there from a different country. There were a few prosecutors in the region, and I said to him, what is the first thing you do when a young female comes to you and says she's been raped? And what do you think he responded to me? Anyone want to guess?
In India, the idea is to start with belief.
Okay, you start with belief.
We start with belief.
That should be, right? But he said to me, I asked her to go home to show me the dress or the clothing she was wearing. And I said, I sort of knew the answer. No, I said to him, is that because you want to know whether there's any semen evidence? He says, no. He said, I need to know whether she really consented to it or not. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, how could she consent to it if she said she was raped? He says, well, if she was showing a lot of bust, for example, if her skirt was short, well, then she invited it, and clearly she wanted it. So it was those types of issues, and those are access to justice issues. If we look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, if we look at the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, everyone has a right to a fair trial. What you say, right? Belief. Good faith belief. But clearly there wasn't a good faith belief. I'll give you another example. This was actually from another country, from Equatorial New Guinea. I was talking to a judge there, and he says to me, he comes up to me, he says, I don't like Spain. He says, I don't like the police in Spain. I said, okay, well, I'm sorry. I said, why don't you like the police in Spain? He says, because when I was there, I was there when I was 29. I have my friend had a problem. So is a friend, no? But I said, well, what was the problem? He says, we were 29, we were taking a course, because there was a former colony of Spain, so they speak Spanish, so sometimes they come to take courses. He was taking a short course on something at a law school there. He says, and my friend who was 29 was having sex with a 13-year-old. And I said, okay, well, that's a problem, but what's your problem with the police of Spain? He says, because the police came and they arrested him and put him in jail eventually. No? And I said, well, okay, but what is the problem? He said, no, in my country what we would do is if a 29-year-old man is sleeping with a 13-year-old, we would bring in a psychologist, and we would demonstrate that perhaps she really wanted to have sex and that she was able to consent, right? A 13-year-old being able to consent with a 29-year-old, which is illegal, no? So that is the type of stuff that we do in order to work with them, to try and talk about these ideas under the Convention, under basic rights of children, how to prosecute. My colleague, for example, did a lot on juvenile justice, on how, for example, this idea of the best interest of the child, right? That if you have to choose between putting a child in jail, which is a last resort in only very limited of cases, or taking the child and putting them with their grandparents in some sort of alternative form of justice. Exactly, alternative approaches, right? Then that's the idea, right? So it's those types of things that the United Nations will often dispatch consultants, academics, as sort of the final phase of the circular process to work with the individual states to try and help them develop better practices, right? And then after about 3 or 4 years, the country will once again go through the process, and it's the same circular process. I'll give you this, this is anecdotal. I showed it when I was teaching this class in Angola on children's rights. 2 years ago, there was a case from Canada. It was a terrible case of, I think she was a woman. She wasn't still a girl, but she was about 18 or 19. She was raped. She was raped anally. Anyway, the judge, you can find the transcripts. I even have them if anyone wants to see them. Not with me, but she was raped, and the judge said to her, she's sitting there, testifying, he said to her, why didn't you just sit down, is what he said to her. Can you imagine? So it's those types of things that will eventually end up in the review process. When they go up for the convention, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, I have no doubt that the committee will specifically call reference to that issue, right? Because it was even another thing he said to her, the judge said, I just want to make a point here, or just ask a question. He says, imagine one day, a girl, a woman, she meets a man, she has sex with him, and then the next day she wakes up, she wishes she didn't do it, then her friends tell her, just say you were raped, say you were raped. He's like, is that a possibility in this case? I mean, could you imagine a judge saying that? I mean, as you said, there's a good faith belief, it's a fact-finding mission, but to cast doubt. So it's those types of things that oftentimes we find end up through the committee review process, where the committee will say, obviously this is unacceptable, and we need to see some sort of change. Now, in the case of the Canadian judge, I think he was removed off the bench. In a similar case in California about 2 years ago, there was a swimmer from Stanford University, I think it was from Stanford. He raped a woman, and I think I forget what it was, but he got, I think, 6 months probation because the judge said, this is a smart guy, and he didn't want to destroy his career. Could you imagine? Yeah. Could you imagine? I mean, it was just a travesty of justice. Those types of things will oftentimes come up. Now, when you deal with developing countries, particularly in an African context, Southeast Asia, for example, obviously the problems are oftentimes deeper, right? I mean, there's larger institutional problems, rule of law issues. I mean, you can imagine it goes much deeper. But anyway, the idea is to go through this circular process where every state that signs on to this gets reviewed. Yeah, everyone following me? Now, this is a really interesting thing. If any of you are looking to work in human rights, look for an NGO that does shadow reports. It's a great opportunity. Check with NGOs to see whether they do shadow reports. Not all of them do. And what you can do is sign up for it. You can intern for the NGO, and you can help them when India comes up for its review. You can work with them to do a shadow report, and it's quite an interesting task. You really learn how to develop, a legal memo and do human rights research. Yeah. So those are the three primary functions. And as I said, all of this information you can find here on the on the website. Each committee has its own process. Yeah. Any questions about that? Okay, now what I want to do is, I want to take a look at how this works. And if you go into your packets, let me see what page it's on. Okay. No, it's just before.
Just checking index, no?
No, it's right here, it's right here. So it's actually for you, it's 108.
103, sir. It's 103.
Oh, yeah, 103, I'm sorry. 103, thank you. 103. So what I want you to do is take a look at this report by Kenya, and then take a look on the final page, on page 105 and 106. You have the general comments. Yeah? And what I want you to do is, if you were the committee on torture, taking into account the general comments, the obligations, and taking into account what Kenya has said, what types of questions, what types of critical analysis would you have for the country of Kenya? Is that clear? Is everyone clear on that? So again, look at the law, look at the general comments, and to what extent do you think Kenya is complying or not with its obligations under the treaty? Okay? You don't need to read I know it's a few, just take a quick skim of it, and then we'll talk about it. Okay? Okay, so the purpose of this exercise is just so you can kind of get a feel for how it works. So the country, or actually the United Nations, they take the law, right? In this case, it's Article 2.1 of the Convention Against Torture. Yeah, and what they do is, based on the general comments, they compare it to the state, right? To see did they or did they not. Is there anything here that stands out as particularly problematic?
See, that means I have one question.
Okay.
It's not an input maybe. Problem is, this committee is sort of lecturing the state how to frame your law.
Yes.
Right? You have to have they are saying, that they are saying that you have to have, specifically you have to identify torture as distinguished from other forms of assault and all that.
Yeah.
So this is sort of, you are guiding a state how to frame your laws.
Yeah.
That, I mean, how come? I mean,
Well, because they signed on to a treaty, no? So they subject themselves to international law. I mean, the moment that, again, I mean, there's always this question of sovereignty, no?
And who will say what is right, ultimately,
Well, you know, from the UN perspective, it's this committee that's made up of distinguished experts on torture. I'll just give you an example. Has anyone ever studied in Washington, D.C.? Anyone? No? Okay. It's called American University Washington College of Law. It's a good university. The former dean, a guy named Claudio Grossman, he's an expert in torture and human rights and the right to be free from torture and inhumane and degrading treatment. Actually, can I give you my phone? Will you take a picture? Thanks. Sorry, I sent it to my law school and they put it on there. I won't look.
Give a pose, no? Stand there.
Before we go, we'll do one selfie together, all of us. But so he, for example, is on that committee, right? And he himself was a former victim, if I'm not mistaken, of torture in Chile. He then moved to the Netherlands, I believe. He did his PhD, and now he spent the last 30, 40 years in the United States, writing and lecturing. I mean, he is one of the leading scholars in the area of torture. So he was the president of the committee, for example. Now, you're absolutely right. I mean, we could all differ on these questions, but you know, when you subject yourself to international law, you subject yourself to the mechanisms. No, I mean, you go into it knowing these mechanisms. So that is the answer. Yeah. Okay. So if we look here, I don't know if that answers your question, but.
More or less.
You know, I mean, there's always philosophical questions of sovereignty, but the basic answer is by signing it, you subject yourself, no? And I think, you know, that's what certainly some countries argue, is that, you know, who are you, is institution of the West, as sometimes they say, to tell us what to do? You know, that is the argument, but, you know, supposedly, the argument that these are human rights, and there are certain...
they have to be in harmony with the cultural parameters.
To an extent. For example, you can't female genital mutilation. That's, even if it's culture, it's prohibited, right? I mean, so there are those things. So there are those questions, yeah. I mean, there are those absolutes. No. Here, so if we look here, it says each party shall take effective legislation, administrative, judicial, or other measures to prevent acts of torture, right? And what the general comments tell us is that they must make the offense punishable. So if you were reading the state report, what would call your attention? Is there anything that would... Does it have... If you look at paragraph 32, it says, in addition, neither the penal code nor the criminal code contain any provisions, right, on a specific offense called torture. However, acts of torture can have been prosecuted under other crimes. That, for example, from the point of view of the United Nations, is non-compliance. Yeah? So that would be something that, if they were willing, the United Nations would send down there someone from their law and governance department to work with them on drafting new legislation for Parliament. Another aspect of this, which we should look at, is state reports frequently lack specific and sufficient information on the implementation of the Convention with respect to women. Does this say anything about women?
Yeah,
Paragraph 22, it tells us that... No, but that's from the general comments.
Yeah.
But from the state report.
From the state report that is on page?
It doesn't tell us. So what I mean is that the state report doesn't say anything about women. One of the things that the general comment says on torture is that there needs to be something, some information specific for women, right? This idea of gender streamlining, that gender should always form some aspect of any analysis, right? Here, for example, that's missing. So that would be another thing that the committee would say, we need information concerning women. And maybe the shadow report would offer that, yeah.
Not if a state has been found guilty for concealing the facts, real facts.
Sorry?
What if a state has been found guilty for concealing the real facts of that?
Then they get called out, they get publicly shamed, but beyond that, not much.
So torture is a peremptory norm of use cogents as well?
Yeah, I mean, torture, it is a preemptory norm, but that is, if there is a very high level of torture, it could eventually rise to be an international criminal offense, right? But in the context of human rights, again, they can get cited, but not much can be done. But you're absolutely right. Torture, if any of you have done international public law, right? It's a preemptory norm, right? That it's automatically prohibited. You can never torture. Even, for example, if she tells me she knows where the bomb is and it's going to go off in 20 minutes, I still can't torture her, right? At least in theory, right? Now in practice, police do all sorts of things, right? But in I can't. No, but anyway. So for this question, one of the things that they want to know is, has there been anything about torture in women? And there hasn't.
Not only about women, about every race, nationality, and every
Yeah. All of that, yeah, and it's not exactly. Another thing, for example, is it says the state report under paragraph 42. In 2003, the Kenya National Committee on Human Rights was established. It has quasi-judicial powers. The commission has hitherto complained that they've been denied permission to visit some facilities. But they don't tell us anything more about the commission. If I were the United Nations, I would want to know, well, what has the commission done? Have they actually investigated any cases? How many cases have come before it? Oftentimes, we'll see language like the United Nations. The government of Cambodia has prosecuted or has appointed a special prosecutor for women, and that's all it says. Well, how many prosecutions have there been? Or sometimes they'll say, last year there were 500 complaints to the prosecutor's office on women, on gender violence. Well, that's very nice. But were any of them actually prosecuted, right? So it's those types of things where the shadow report can come in handy, because the state tries not to hide too much, but they put it in kind of vague terminology. You're absolutely right. Sometimes things are hidden. Other times they put it in kind of nice flowery language. Now, last year there were 2,000 complaints based on violence towards children. Okay, complaints are good, but better that there's actually convictions or prosecutions of those who hurt children, right? So it's those types of issues that come out through the United Nations review process, and then again it goes through this sort of circular review where eventually the United Nations will offer to provide assistance if needed. Yeah? Is that clear? Yeah? Again, the idea is really just so that you can see how the process works. Now, let me ask you this. What is the problem here with this process? Apart from the fact, as you said, that it doesn't have teeth, right? That it can certainly say, India, you haven't done this right, you need to improve it, we'll see you again in 4 years. That's really what the committee can do, right? But what happens if you're not a signatory to the convention? Do you go to that committee? No, you don't. So where do you go? Chai, thank you very much. Chai. Okay, break time now. I love chai.
I love chai. You said that.
Huh?
You said that yesterday.
Oh, did I? Yeah. I love it. I said, did I come here to teach a class or did I come here to drink chai? And it's like my wife always says, do you love me or do you love Spain? And I said, you better don't ask me that question. You don't want to know the answer. No, I happen to love Spain. Because I think you came here for Spain. And no, just joking. But anyway, okay. So because not every state has to go through a review process. For example, the United States. The United States hasn't signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so it's not required to go through a review process. What it does do, though, is that in Geneva, about every 3 or 4 years, there's another process called the Universal Periodic Review. Yeah, it's called the UPR process. And that is that every member nation of the United Nations goes through this process. It's basically similar to the committee process, but it's for every country. Regardless of what treaties you've signed, regardless of what, regardless of anything, you go through the process. Now, the big difference between the committee and the UPR process is that the committee is made up of experts, yeah? The UPR process is made up of member nations, representatives from member nations. And for me, that is the big problem with the UPR process. The UPR process, in my opinion, is not a serious process. If you look at, sometimes you get some interesting commentary, but if you look at, for example, the review of Saudi Arabia, for instance. All of Saudi Arabia's colleagues, member nations in the area, say Saudi Arabia on women's rights, excellent. Saudi Arabia is not so good on women's rights. you're doing very good, you know, maybe you could do this better. And then other countries which have problems with Saudi Arabia, Iran always says, terrible job, Saudi Arabia. So the problem is it converts into, it's a very politicized process. I was looking recently at the report from Qatar, for instance. No? In Qatar, the commentaries that are given through this process are very general. You need to improve women's rights. You need to improve the rights of child. You need to improve worker rights. And that's really the extent of it. Because it's member countries that review each other, sort of a peer review process, it has this real sort of diplomatic, collegial element to it. Everyone follow what I'm saying? And so, again, it's a process that some people argue has helped, and I don't doubt that it maybe has helped a little bit. It calls attention in some cases to human rights violations. But in my opinion, the more serious process is the committee process.
Yeah, it's very superficial, no?
Superficial, exactly. That's a better word, yeah. Yeah, it's superficial. Yeah. The committee process is more in-depth. I mean, the committee process, like anything, there's always an element of politics when we deal with the United Nations, but it's much more critical. It has a greater capacity because of those who sit on the committee to actually provide a meaningful review. Each of those members that's on the committee represents not any country, but they represent the issue, right? I mean, they represent themselves. Whereas comparatively in the UPR process, each person who sits there in a room just like yourselves, it looks like this, you know, it'd be India, China, United States, right, Cambodia, whatever, and you speak from the point of view of your government, right? So that inherently limits the effectiveness of that process. So again, we can go into lots of tiny little details, but just to give you an idea, so we have the committee process as one, and then we have the review process, yeah, as another. Okay, everyone follow that? The third part, aspect of the United Nations, is it has what are called Rapa Tours. Yeah? Has anyone heard of that before? A Rapa Tour is someone who's appointed by the Secretary General through the Human Rights Commission, or the Human Rights Council. And what they do is they monitor one specific issue.
How do you spell this word?
Well, you know, every time I write it on the board, someone who speaks French always corrects me, but it's R-A-P-P-A-T-E-O-U-R. Rapa Tours, something like that. That's how it is. Okay? I may have spelled it, but it's right around there. And a rapporteur is appointed with consent of the United Nations Secretary General, and that rapporteur is specialized in one question, he or she. So there's a rapporteur for freedom of expression. There's a sort of like a rapporteur for violence against children. There's a rapporteur against torture, for example. And what they do is they are the representative of the United Nations on that issue. They can oftentimes provide information to the individual committees that we just talked about. They can also receive and investigate complaints. So you can file a complaint with the rapporteur for torture. And they go on fact-finding missions. So they will visit the country, assuming that the country allows them to enter. Because of sovereignty, the country doesn't have to allow them to enter. And they will investigate complaints. They'll meet with the government. They'll provide technical assistance in terms of how that government can improve its record on that specific issue.
So this is one individual or a body?
It's one individual, and then they have
I mean, he has to have the mechanism to investigate.
Yeah, I mean, they have assistants behind them that do it. But they are sort of the representative. So you can sort of think of it as the Secretary General's representative on freedom of expression, right? And there's not one on every single human right. It's based on certain important priority issue areas determined by the United Nations. Yeah, but what they do again is they'll provide commentary. So if any of you are doing a report, for example, on freedom of expression, a good place to start is go to the website of the rapporteur, and there's lots of information. They do country by country report. So if you want to see what the special rapporteur for freedom of expression says about India, you can go online and download the report. If there's a problem here, you can file a complaint with the special rapporteur. No, so it's an important mechanism on individual human rights questions. Who is the rapporteur? It's usually someone who has vast experience in that specific issue. They may have previously worked on the committee, for example, on civil and political rights and They're specialized in that area, and as a consequence, they later get appointed to be the special rapporteur. Yeah, everyone follow that? So just to review what we've talked about so far, the United Nations, in terms of how it monitors human rights, one is through its committees, one is through UPR, one is through its rapporteurs. Yeah. Now, what else can it do? So those are three areas where we can think of it as kind of a soft power, right? In the sense that if for example, Israel doesn't submit its report which it hasn't, to the UPR, or I don't think it has at least, they can publicly shame them. It'll be in the news, and it'll be in the New York Times. There was an article a few years ago in the New York Times about how Israel doesn't always comply or doesn't always submit. It embarrasses them. It's embarrassing for the government, but that's kind of the extent, right? I mean, that's more or less what can happen. Now, what about when something, yeah?
What's the difference between a shadow report and rapporteur?
So, a rapporteur works for the United Nations, and they investigate based on fact-finding mission, right? Their own evaluation based on a United Nations team. A shadow report is done by NGOs.
Like functioning functions are similar. Finding even the NGOs are finding based on the facts and statistics.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell that there's some overlap, but the shadow report goes through the committee report, right? I mean, it's part of the committee process, whereas the rapporteur is separate from the committee process. The rapporteur is his or her own person, or its own entity. Does that make sense? So the shadow report gets submitted when the state is being reviewed. Only when the state is being reviewed. And that is from the point of view of an NGO that's working in the field, right? Whereas the shadow report, the rapporteur report is an expert in one area, supposedly, right? It is a specific expert on freedom of expression. The shadow report tends to be all the different issues of the convention. Is that clear? Whereas the rapporteur is something very specific. Freedom of expression. Is that okay? I mean, yeah, there's overlap. I mean, that's the United Nations. I mean, there's a lot of it, but supposedly each one has a different function, right? Okay, so we have those three issues, which are somewhat of a soft power. Then the question is, what if something is, for example, there's widespread and systematic torture, for example, as I think you pointed out, right? Which is in the case of, for instance, or there's a genocide, like in the case of, let's see, Sudan, for example. What was you going to say? Saddam Hussein. Where?
Serbia.
Serbia. Yeah, okay. There, for example. In that cases, and in very, very limited cases, the Security Council, under its powers in, I think it's Articles 41, 42, 43, can take certain measures to stop those acts, right? Where we could say more hard power. What can they do? They could, for example, place sanctions on a country, right? Economics, like for example, North Korea. Trade embargoes, right? Economic sanctions. They could place specific sanctions on a leader, for example, right? They can freeze their bank accounts, for instance, right? So those are the types of acts that the United Nations that the Security Council can take.
These are the rights which the United Nations have.
Yeah, under the Security Council.
For example, in Syria, when the president of Syria, when he spread the poisonous gas over his citizens, the US launched dozens of Tomahawk missiles on the land and the air bases.
Yeah.
Was that justified?
It was not abuse.
It was not what?
That was a presidential action. It was not, prior consent was not taken from the Congress for that.
Yes. You mean in...
Donald Trump, he's talking about the US missile attack.
In Syria.
In Syria, very recently.
Yeah. I mean, in theory, it should usually go through the Security Council. Is the way that that's the right course for it to take. It should go through, unless it's a question of immediate self-defense, then they can act. Right?
I
but
think
in
Security Council gets the power under Article Chapter 7 of
Yeah.
the UN Charter.
41, 42, 43. Yeah, exactly. So that's the other thing that they can do is they can authorize the use of force. Remember, for instance, in the case of Iraq, when the United States wanted to go into Iraq some years ago, they first proposed it to the UN Security Council. Remember that? The Security Council said no, and then they did it anyway, which is in theory illegal under international law, unless there's some sort of justifiable reason like self-defense. No immediate self-defense. But But anyway, so one is they can create sanctions. The second is the United Nations Security Council can authorize the use of force. Now, keep in mind that the United Nations doesn't have its own military. It has peacekeepers, but it doesn't have offensive military capabilities, right? So what it can do is it can authorize a country to act in those questions. Does everyone follow that?
Yes.
Okay. And then the other thing that the Security Council can do is peacekeeping operations, right? That is, it can authorize peacekeeping to avoid continued human rights violations. We see that, for example, in a number of African countries, Central African Republic, Congo, Chad, South Sudan, East Timor in Asia. It also can authorize peacekeeping forces there as well. Again, that's not an offensive force, but it does allow as a way of maintaining or hopefully protecting human rights. Yeah.
So in case of Rwanda, when I was reading about the Rwanda genocide,
Yeah.
so there were reports that even the peacekeepers, they were molesting the children and the women there. So what is there to check on the peacekeepers that they are acting within a, is there some regulatory body that, okay, this is what they're supposed to do, this is the mechanism of acting, how do they implement that
So
process?
that has been one of the big complaints of peacekeepers, particularly in the Congo, that they themselves have been carrying out a lot of sexual violence against women and children. No, the United Nations has made a big push to try and train them better, to have internal audits. There have been a number of internal reports that have come out which have demonstrated, but there's not really a check and balance, that would prevent them from doing it. It has to be more, there are, there's not that mechanism in place, unfortunately. I mean, there's the internal UN mechanisms, but beyond that, there's not that much. Okay, is that clear? So again, the United Nations, two areas. One are its soft powers through the committees, through the reviews, and then in very rare cases, we have these sort of harder powers, which are through the Security Council, embargoes, sanctions, and in some cases, military force. Now, the problem we know with the Security Council is its politicized nature, right? The veto power, which, sorry? Yeah, the 5 permanent members are required to unanimously support. That has been obviously has led to major tragedy. One of the most recent examples is Rwanda, right? That there wasn't consensus. Syria is the other, because Syria is protected by Russia. In the case of North Korea, it's protected by China. And there's a big push, obviously, by many people to democratize the Security Council. One of the big arguments is that India should be on it, right? Obviously, the world's biggest democracy certainly deserves a place on the Security Council. I think many people would agree with that, but because of the structure, it's at this point not possible. So, again, even though we have this sort of hard power mechanism in place in the United Nations, the veto nature of it, right? The 5 permanent members, at the end of the day, serves to slow down the progress of the United Nations. Yeah. And any questions? Any questions on that? No? Question? Oh no, you had a hand like that. No? Okay, good. All right. What time is it? What time do we take a break? At 4:30. We have 20 minutes. Right? I don't think that's right, actually.
So what's your stance on the veto? So the nations have been given the veto power. Should there be a privilege given to these 5 nations, or shouldn't there be?
So just because they were the signatories in the first place, just
Exactly.
because they were the original members, as we call them. So this is not fair to the other nations who have joined that later, right?
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, I think that it's an outdated.
It's a very discriminatory practice inside the United Nations.
It's outdated. I mean, I think when the United Nations was created and there was a need for those nations, the biggest nation of the world, to maintain what they thought was to maintain economic, social stability, which may have been justifiable at that point. I think there's evidence to suggest that it was. But nowadays, I think it's a tragedy. I think actually, the United Nations is to blame in some part for a lot of the world's problems these days. I mean, if we look at what the preamble of United Nations is, it's to prevent the scourge of war, right, and to protect human rights. If we look at it from 1946 up until the present, it's been conflict after conflict after conflict. It's true we haven't had a world war, although perhaps we're heading there.
Sir,
But
the damage which is there in the individual, like communal violence is inside the countries, that is much more than the result of the two world wars combined.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, and I think a part of it at least is because of the dysfunction of the United Nations, that there's no reason why those 5 powers should have final say on all these questions of whether there's military intervention, whether there's sanctions. Because if we see how it plays out, the United States always protects Israel. China protects North Korea. Russia protects Syria. France was again, I think it was France and the United States were against sending in military to Rwanda, where we had 1 million people who died in 80 days. At the end of the day, there have been some successes. I don't, some unilateral actions that have perhaps arguably been successes, but there's no reason why those powers should be the ones determining basic human rights, essentially, right? I mean, what's going on in Syria is it's a tragedy. It's nothing short of a tragedy, and yet the United Nations hasn't been able to act, right? If it were democratized, I absolutely think that there'd be a difference.
So there are a lot of financial assistance is given by these nations. Say, for instance, United States. So these nations need an incentive to be a part of the United Nations.
Yeah. Well, and that is one of the big problems. It's similar to in the United States. One of the problems is lobbying, right, and the financial contribution. Similar, it's the same idea. It's similar, in the sense that once the United States, Russia, and these countries say we're no longer paying for the United Nations, if we don't get a seat, we're not participating anymore. Sorry?
It won't exist without financial.
Exactly, and that is for that reason why there really hasn't been reform, because of the dependency on these countries, right? Again, from the outside point of view, it's easy for us to say, look, if you don't want to be part of it, you don't be part of it, right? I mean, that at the end of the day, if we're going to have the United Nations, it needs to function, it needs to be there to accurately and adequately respect human rights. So from my point of view, I'm in full agreement that we probably shouldn't have any 5 permanent members anymore. That's an outdated system, and that's a system that needs to democratize to allow, for example, majority vote, or some other form. Because anytime you have to have unanimous vote by 5 members, we're going to run into the same problem. Even if we had India, for example. At the end of the day, as long as they have India has 1 vote, and they can use that vote to either support something or completely kill something, we're going to end up in the same problems. The problem is not so much necessarily which countries have it, although that is a problem. The problem more is its veto power. And until we get rid of that veto power, I think we're going to continually be in the same situation, where there's always going to be economic, political, and other interests that lead to the stopping of human rights protection.
So it's easier said than done. So there needs to be another model. Is there any other model available?
The United Nations has explored other models. There was a committee appointed under, it was Kofi Annan or Ban Ki-moon, that proposed a number of different options. Doing away with the veto power, increasing the size of it to include India, for example. But there's never been any action on it, right? That's the problem with it, because ultimately the United States and other countries have stopped it from advancing. But proposals there have been a number of important proposals. You can find them online. But in terms of actually going anywhere, there's a lot of lip service paid to it, but there's not really any action.
So there's also this one thing that they do, that none of the Secretary General is appointed from the 5 permanent members.
Yeah.
That is sort of like an incentive to other countries, like you can just be there.
Yeah.
But sir, then since he's, even if he's appointed and he's not a permanent member, he does not really have the power, just the name that he has, right? Because ultimately the power rests with the permanent members.
Exactly. I mean, that is the issue. I mean, the Security Council, the Secretary General can give input and can give advice, but at the end of the day, the body that authorizes.
Don't you think there should be any authoritative power with the Secretary General?
I mean, that's another possibility, is to reform the United Nations to provide more authority. I mean, these are broader questions outside of human rights. So I don't want to get too far into them, but we can talk about them later. But yeah, I think the message to take away here is that the United Nations, I think it has advanced in many ways human rights, but on questions that really involve, torture, killing, freedom, I think there's a lot of difficulty there in advancing human rights, particularly because of politics. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
As you mentioned earlier, international law almost means
possible when its member states are not bound to abide by its norms?
When its member nations are not bound?
To abide by its norms.
Well, they are bound. Another thing is that they violate them.
No, actually in case of Israel, as you mentioned, that Israel have violated the regulation of the UN. They have been criticized.
Of which?
Israel.
Yeah.
Mentioned the UN have criticized them for violating their norms, but they can't do anything against it. Any force.
No, I mean, they really can't. I mean, the only time that there have been one or two cases is, for example, if a country doesn't make payment, they can be suspended from voting rights, for example. But it never happens. It never happens. And that is, I mean, the sad reality of human rights protection at the UN level, is that it has serious inherent limitations to it. Countries are bound by customary law. Countries are bound by the law of the treaties. But another thing is that they don't comply. And when that country doesn't comply, they can be given a slap on the wrist, for example. They can be publicly shamed by the United Nations. But unless they really rise to a huge level, like Syria, like Sudan, South Sudan, it's never going to make it to the Security Council where there's a possibility of intervention, sanctions, or other modes of protection. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Okay. So yeah, I mean, we can be idealistic about human rights, but at the end of the day, we also have to accept a certain reality about human rights. And that reality is that human rights have limits in terms of their protection from the UN level. And that these mechanisms exist. I think they're useful in some respects. They've certainly advanced human rights in certain areas. If we look at water rights, food rights, there's been a lot of advance in those areas. But there are other areas that I think the United Nations has struggled more to stop. Torture, for example, freedom of expression, those rights which really potentially threaten a regime, those are harder for the United Nations to control. And when the governments say, we're not going to listen to the United Nations, or we're going to hide what we do, the United Nations really can't do much, because each state at the end of the day has its sovereignty. And unless a case goes through the Security Council, there's a real limitation to their reach. Okay?
So people are also denied access to justice. Like some reporters, they were in China. I was reading through the materials. There was this reporter in China, and he had reported in a newspaper, and then he was imprisoned for 10 years, and he was not allowed any visitors, and he was not even given access to justice. So what do we do in these cases?
Yeah.
Where do we approach?
In those cases, complaints to the United Nations.
So that he's not even allowed to have any visitors, what will he do? Isn't he helpless in that case?
Yes.
What do we do, sir? So that is a gross violation of human rights.
In those cases, I mean, an NGO could present its case to the United Nations, for example. Embassies can lodge complaints wherever. Where is this person from? Is he Chinese?
No, sir, he wasn't Chinese.
I don't recall exactly the incident.
He was Chinese.
Okay.
He was Chinese.
So in that case, I mean, it would be the United Nations that would, we'll see, for example, when we talk about Europe, there are other protections at the European level. But yeah, I mean, that's a good example, is what happens when, for example, the Chinese dissident, he died last year when he was a Chinese Nobel Prize laureate. He worked a lot in human rights. He was in prison. He died of, it was liver cancer. He was detained without due process, without access to justice. And what can happen in those cases? Well, the United Nations was getting involved. There were a number of Rapa Tours that made visits to the United Nations. Other countries called on China when it got reviewed, for example, to release this prisoner. But if China says we're not going to do it, China says we're not going to do it. And that is,
That is a limitation to that.
That is a limitation. I mean, look, this guy had been in prison for a very long time, and people have been for years. I mean, look at, for example, Amnesty International just came out with a report about Syria. You can find it online. It's published, about the atrocities, 300 pages. Well, actually, 2 or 3 years ago, there was another report that came out from the United Nations on torture and human rights violations in North Korea. 3 years has gone by, and North Korea is doing the same, right? So even though the United Nations has published this report, it's provided testimony, it's tried to lobby them. At the end of the day, countries have sovereignty, and unless the Security Council is willing to send in a police force or to send in a military force through another country, that is a limitation to human rights. And we have to obviously continue fighting for human rights, but we also have to accept that there are inherent limitations, that as much as we may be angry that a journalist is detained because of freedom of press, violation of freedom of press, or because political prisoners are being tortured in...
So shouldn't there be when we're talking about sedition, so is there, can there not be a, international mechanism, okay, this will constitute sedition, and that would be universal for all the countries. Can there not be an international law in that respect?
Absolutely. I mean, there can be the creation of that. But again, all of these laws, all of these norms depend on state implementation, right? I mean, it's not that the United Nations implements it. It's that the United Nations creates the law, and then the states have to implement it. So if a state is unwilling to implement it, sovereignty, they can be publicly shamed, they can get a slap on the wrist. But that is the limitation to what they can really...
According to Austin, even the biggest drawback of international law is that it doesn't have sanctions. It's a state willing. The law is totally upon the state, the way state implemented. We cannot, force any state because it's about sovereignty of any state. So we cannot, punish them that you are not implementing this law, because international law is a law or not is a big debatable topic even now.
Exactly. Yeah. That's it. It depends on the states. Yeah.
Adding an example to that, the question is how effective is international law? Like, for an example, last year, Russia decided to leave the membership of the International Criminal Court. Now, it does not come under the jurisdiction of International Criminal Court, so it cannot be sued for genocide, for say war crimes or
unless it goes to the Security Council.
Yeah.
But Russia's on the Security Council, right? So that makes it a little difficult that Russia says we're going to subject ourselves. But it could. That's under the Rome Statute. I don't want to get too far off course here, but under the Rome Statute, there are 4 ways in which, and one of them is Security Council.
And even the grounds of intervention under the UN Charter is very limited. Yes. So these are only 7 or 8 grounds for intervention in any sovereignty or in any state. So we cannot say that the state should directly intervene, because it's about the sovereignty of a state and sending militaries and putting any weapons.
So doesn't that not just render the purpose of an international organization?
Yeah, that is a debatable topic even now.
Right.
That is, the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations once said publicly, we could basically cut off every floor in this building, in the United Nations building, and it would be just as unuseful. Sort of what, and there's different ways of looking at it, right? I mean, at the end of the day, international relations has lots of theories, and there's realist theory and so on, and it's a question of how we want to understand it. That is, do we want to work towards the United Nations? And many countries contribute positively to the United Nations. But you also have countries, particularly those on the Security Council, which oftentimes believe themselves exempt from the work of the United Nations, even though they are members. In theory, they have obligations, but as you said, the way the Charter was drafted is that it ultimately respects, and it says it, I think, specifically, that sovereignty is paramount. So it was drafted in a way that allowed countries to be a part of it, but at the same time retain that sovereignty. And that is really the big limitation of the United Nations, that when a country doesn't want to comply, whether it be with humanitarian questions or whether it is with human rights questions, the United Nations has its hands tied, and that is a big limitation. Yeah. Anyway, we got a little bit off course. Any final points? Do you want to take attendance?
I want to take attendance.
Then we'll take a break, a 15-minute break, and then we'll return and we'll continue talking about this. Okay?
You can sit in.
We're ready to rock and roll? Yeah? Okay, good. Good. So, again, just returning to our conversation, effectiveness of the United Nations, we could spend the next week talking about it. So I don't want to go into it anymore, but just my own opinion, just to make it clear, is that the United Nations is an extremely, extremely useful body, but we also have to recognize, as I think many of you correctly pointed out, certain basic limitations. One obviously being the veto power, the other obviously being just sovereignty. I think in terms of human rights, where I think United Nations has advanced a lot is what I would maybe call more benign human rights. Social rights, right? Right to food, right to water. All of what is connected with the Millennium Development Goals, with the exception of climate change. I think that has advanced quite considerably. I think where the United Nations struggles, because it conflicts with sovereignty, is in the question of civil and political rights mainly, right? freedom of right to be free from torture, right to vote, right to freedom of expression. Why is that? Because it ultimately it threatens regime stability. If we look at Africa, for example, Gambia, Zimbabwe, they've had dictators there for 25, 30 years, up until very recently when Mugabe, do you know Mugabe? Have you heard of him, Robert? The president was kicked out. The president of Gambia last year. But for 25, 30 years, they had limited freedom of expression, they had issues of torture, and the United Nations would repeatedly tell them, you need to do this, you need to do that. But once they provide for the right to vote, once they allow all opposition candidates to be free, that's the moment that that regime is threatened. Everyone follow me? And so that's why I think in certain areas like water, food, and so on, they've advanced. But in areas that may potentially threaten regime change, those are areas where it's been much harder for the United Nations. Okay? Anyway, those are my concluding remarks. So anyway, so what we've talked about up until now, we have these human rights. Yeah, we have all these human rights, all these different treaties. We know that they're implemented in through the work of the United Nations down to the states, right? It's United Nations creates it, states implement it, and United Nations is a mechanism for review, for making sure that states meet their obligations under these treaties. But what we also know is that the United Nations has limited effectiveness. It has effectiveness, but limited by structural and other mechanisms, right? So the question then becomes, what are other ways in which human rights may be implemented, yeah, or protected? And outside of the international arena, United Nations, we also have regional mechanisms. And in particular, we have three main regional mechanisms. One being the African mechanism, the other one being the Inter-American mechanism, and the third one being the European. Yeah? Now, what we need to, we'll go through each one by one, but what you need to be aware of is that each of these mechanisms corresponds to a regional human rights treaty or convention. Everyone understand that? So, each of those treaties can provide more rights than the United Nations, but it can provide less rights. Everyone understand that? So, for example, in Europe, we have what's called the European Convention on Human Rights. Yeah. That is, it reflects what's in the UN Convention, in some respects, but it doesn't take away any rights, right? Because the United Nations treaty law is the minimum standard. Everyone follow that? Now, in order to create more teeth, we could say, to create more sort of a regional protection of human rights, we have these three mechanisms. And those three mechanisms hear cases, hear complaints brought on by individuals against a state. Yeah. For example, we'll read a number of cases over the next few days, but the European Court on Human Rights. The European Court on Human Rights hears cases from, what is it, about 48 states in Europe. It's not the European Union, but it's all of Europe. Yeah, the Council of Europe. And that is that any individual who has been wronged by state action, where the state has failed to protect, respect, or fulfill their human rights, can go to the European Court of Human Rights. For example, right? So let me think of it. I'll give you an example. In Spain, for instance, we have a law that prohibits protesting in front of the Congress. That's true. In that case, once I've exhausted certain remedies, and the state has ruled for the state against me, I can take my case to the European Court. That is sort of like the Supreme Court of human rights in Europe. Everyone understand that? Okay? So I want to now go over some of the specific human rights issues in each region. Okay. So the first is in Africa. Yeah. Africa, as we know, has long suffered from human rights abuses. Yeah, we'll talk a bit about what I think are some of the big issues in Africa. But Africa, Africa, coming out of colonialism, yeah, in the 60s, created what was called the Organization of African Unity. In the Organization of African Unity, what was created essentially to help create social and economic unity at a Pan-African level. Everyone understand that? That is, we had countries that were coming out of British colonialism, French colonialism, in some cases German colonialism, Belgian colonialism, and as starting in about 1962 or so, we begin to see countries break away from colonialism through civil wars, for example in Angola, which came later on, again from Portugal, through votes of independence, and in some cases through colonial country withdrawal. And what we get from there is a process of African unity, or attempted unity in Africa. And one of the things that was meant to be dealt with, although was not the centerpiece of African unity, was the question of human rights. And in 1981, we get what's called the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Yeah, and that is the first Pan-African charter which applies not just to sub-Saharan Africa, but to all of Africa, to protect human rights. Yeah, it's modeled, it's very similar to, we'll talk about a few differences, but it is in many ways similar to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the international covenants, right? It incorporates a lot of that. And what this charter does is, through it and through its protocol, it established in 1987 the African Commission, which is based in Banjul, Gambia. Yeah, and the African Commission is in many ways similar to the United Nations, although it's focused only on human rights. It's the Commission for Human and People's Rights. And what it does is it monitors the human rights situation on a Pan-African level. And it has many of the same, we'll talk about it in a moment, but it has many of the same functions as the committees do, or as the United Nations do with respect to human rights. We also have, starting here, the African Court on Human and People's Rights, which is based in Tanzania, in Arusha, Tanzania. So we have two mechanisms in Africa. We have, there are other little things, but the two main mechanisms are the African Commission and the African Court. Yeah. Now, in addition to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, it's a little hard. I'll have Kavita send all of you these presentations. Yeah. But we also have a number of other human rights treaties in Africa, right? The African Charter on Democracy, the Protocol on Women's Rights. What else? Some of these aren't exactly. The Rights and Welfare of the Child, and then refugee rights. Yeah. By the way, the Organization of African Unity eventually becomes, anyone know? The African Union. Have you all heard of the African Union? So it was the precursor to the African Union. Is that clear? Yeah? Okay. So we have all, these are all the human rights treaties that we have. And the Commission and the Court are authorized through these treaties to enforce the law. Is that clear? Yeah. Now, if we look, just to give you a general idea, not all of them, not every country has signed on to all the treaties. The African Charter is signed on by most, but not all. On the rights of the child, only 48 of, I think it's 52 countries in total have signed on. On the protocol establishing the African Court, only 30 countries, for example. The Maputo Protocol on Women's Rights, only about 39 countries have signed it. So even though we have these human rights mechanisms, not every country in Africa actually is bound by it. If I'm not mistaken now, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, everyone has signed, but not the other treaties. Is that clear? So the African Charter, the main document, sort of the equivalent of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that is signed by every country now in Africa, if I'm not mistaken. I think it is signed by every country. But these other treaties, like the Maputo Protocol, which is on the rights of women, the African Charter on the rights of children, not all of them are signed. Now, the two mechanisms that we have, wow, this is not so good, but the African Commission and the African Court on Human and People's Rights. What this says here, I don't know why it came out so poorly, but what it says there, actually let me, doesn't help so much. But what it has there is it lists the mechanisms that we have. So apart from the treaties, similar to the United Nations, we also have committees that monitor the treaties. And we also have special rapporteurs. Yeah, everyone follow that? Okay. Now, if we look at, for example, how these function. For instance, here, this is the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, which was started in 2004. In total, they've made 15 visits. To give you an idea of some of the problems. If we look at this one, on the Special Rapporteur for people in detention and people in prison without access to trial, there have only been 9 visits since 1996. So think about it. So with all of the problems that we have in Africa, which are a lot, there have only been 15 visits made to countries in the last 13 years. About 1 visit per year. Everyone follow that? So again, that should immediately start to spark something in our mind. What does that tell us to begin with about the African Commission? What conclusion might we draw? And even in general, if we look at other things, Special Rapporteur on Refugees or Internally Displaced People, 11. The Special Rapporteur on Women, which was created in 1999, 10 visits. What does it tell us about that? What does it tell us? Yeah, that there's something that is limiting its functioning, right? That in a place like Africa, it's 52 countries, 1 billion people, some of the lowest levels of human development, right? It always falls on the lowest levels of human development. We've only had, in most cases, 5, 10 visits into human rights problems. So that in itself is quite telling. Now, if we look at what exactly each of these do, again, same idea, the African Commission, state reporting, shadow reports, as we said, individual complaint mechanisms where people can complain directly to the Commission. Those are called communications. Hearings, NGOs formed where NGOs can come together to give their complaints. And then everyone know what an amici curiae is? Where friends of the court, right? That is someone who's not associated with the Commission. When someone submits a complaint, an NGO, for example, or a university can submit their own opinion on it to try and help guide the Commission. Everyone understand that? And so what this does is when, in almost all instances, when there is an individual complaint, let's say you live in Uganda, I'll give you an example. When I was doing my thesis, my doctoral thesis, I interviewed a lot of sex workers. Yeah, interviewed a lot of sex workers, and I mean the stories that they would tell me were, I mean, things that the level of abuse and sexual violence were beyond what I think any of us could probably imagine. But one of the things that they wanted was an NGO for sex workers that the government kept prohibiting. The government said, no, it's immoral, and the NGO wasn't going to work as a brothel. I mean, the NGO wasn't going to be a sex club. I mean, the NGO was there to advocate on their behalf, but the government refused to allow it. That is in violation of the right to association, right? So in the event that they were refused that, they could eventually take the case to the Commission, and then if let's say I'm a law professor at a university, and I know that there's a case pending with the Commission, I can submit an amicus curiae saying this is my opinion on freedom of expression in the African context. Everyone understand that? Yeah. And again, the law that they're applying here is not the law of the Universal Declaration or the International Covenants, but what they're applying is the African Charter, precisely. Okay? Now, what they give here are decisions, but they're non-binding. Okay? They're non-binding decisions. So it is a commission, it's an adjudicative body, very similar to the committees of the United Nations. Now, in the event that a state fails to comply with a decision, the individual can then go through the African court. Right? Everyone understand that? Yeah? Clear? Okay. So it goes from here, and then in some cases it goes here. Now, when we talk about how many cases come here per year, we're talking about 5-10 cases a year. Now, considering the number of violations of human rights in Africa, that should also tell us something, right? In total, here, we get somewhere about 100 cases per year. That in itself should also tell us something, right? That why is it that more people aren't going there? When we talk about the budget, anyone want to take a guess at what the budget is of the African court? What do people think? About $1.5 million a year. Maybe it's increased a little bit. But a big court, a court that supposedly monitors human rights around all of Africa. Africa is, again, it's massive. It's massive. It's about just the Congo alone is the size of Western Europe, to give you an idea of just how big it is, right? 1 billion people, yet they only have a budget of 1.5 billion. This one's budget is about 4 or 5 million. I'm sorry, 1.5 million. Also about 4 or 5 million here. So they're underfunded institutions to begin with. Yeah. Just a few other points. The African court, what it can do is, again, it can take contentious cases, but it can also take advisory cases. Everyone know what an advisory case is? That is that a state can ask its opinion in a non-binding way, right? That if a state is going to create a new law in Parliament, they can ask the court whether or not it is a constitutional matter, whether it's constitutional under the Charter. Everyone understand that? Okay. Now, again, if we look at the mechanisms, challenges, delays, lack of timely response, the average case goes through the commission in about 7 to 8 years, sometimes less. So if we think about it, 7 to 8 years, and then if you don't like the opinion or if the state, then it can first go to the court. So we're looking at a review process in total of what could be 12, 13, 14 years before your human rights case is adjudicated. That in itself speaks to an ineffectiveness, right, in terms of the court. Again, the best way to do it is to be able to go in front of the court or in front of the commission. That is a problem where in a continent where you still have poverty rates of about 50, 60%. 60% of the population lives in rural areas. So it's extremely difficult to use it as an effective process. Now, one thing to point out is if we look at, there's something called the optional protocol, which allows individuals, rather than going through the commission, to go directly to the court. Everyone understand that? So you can bypass that. How many countries have allowed direct entry? Burkina Faso, Ghana, Malawi, Mali, Rwanda, and Tanzania. 6. Only 6 countries have signed the optional protocol to allow individuals to go directly to the court. That in itself, again, tells us something else, that the member states themselves, the presidents, the prime ministers, are not fully committed to protection of human rights, right? Everyone follow me? Yeah? Okay. One thing about, I was saying this before, one thing I love about India is people do that a lot to say yes, and they do that a lot to say no. And sometimes I say, do you understand? And I see people go like that, or like that, and I have no idea. When I first moved to India a few years ago, I remember I would get into a rickshaw and I would say, can you take me to Connaught Place? And the guy would go like that, and then I would get in and he said, I told you no. And I was like, okay, but he went like that. And I love though, it's one of my favorite, and the more time you spend here, I notice, when I go back to Spain, my wife asks me a question, and I go like that, and no, she doesn't know what I'm thinking. No, it's famous though, India is famous for that. Do you know about that? No? If you go, yeah.
So, out of the box. So, we talked about general comment.
Oh, are they going to talk about that? Yeah.
So we talked about general comment that it's a commentary or an explanation on the law. So is it binding? Does it have the same binding effect as the law itself? Like
Yeah. It does have the same binding, but it's as it's called a general comment, right? So it guides the states in terms of what they have to do. For example, water has to be accessible. It's not a suggestion. It is what the law says. But it's up to the state to determine how to make it accessible. Do you understand?
Yeah.
Okay. So it is binding, but it's extremely general is the thing. So it doesn't say you have to reduce, you have to have 100% of people have water. I mean, it says all. Or, for example, it doesn't say you have to have water prices at no more than 20% below the poverty. It doesn't say that specifically, but it just tells states it has to be accessible. It tells them what it has to do.
So for example, General Comment 34 on Article 19 of ICCPR.
Yeah.
So can we take, say a statement from General Comment 34 and say that, it's law, it's binding, it does have a binding effect just as Article 19 says.
Yeah, exactly. It's an explanation of what the law requires. Yeah. So a state couldn't say, if a state, let's say there's one on juvenile justice, right? If a state is constantly putting children or minors in prison instead of alternative, it's in violation of it. Yeah. But again, it doesn't say exactly what they have to do, right? It just gives guidance, or it gives, not guidance, it tells them the general idea of what it's about. But it's up to the state to determine how to implement it, always within the parameters of the general comment. Does that make sense? Okay, so because the general comment is quite broad, it leaves it up to the state oftentimes to determine exactly how they're going to implement it. But you cannot do something that violates the general comments. It has to be within the parameters of the general comment.
So there's a dispute. There are two parties. Both parties use general comment to interpret the law and say, no, we are right. So just as you said, it comes down to the states on how they implement the law.
Right, but it's the committee that would decide whether or not they're acting
according.
Exactly. So let's say, for instance, let's go back to water rights, just because I'm interested in water rights. No, and let's say the state says, every day we're going to bring a truck and we're going to fill up water every day. So the state says that's meeting our obligations. The other person says, no, it's not meeting your obligations because actually it has to be accessible constantly, right? It has to be always accessible. So in that case, yeah, the fact that there has to be constant availability of water, that would violate this idea of just bringing in a truck and every morning people fill up 20 bottles and then go home. Did you understand? So it doesn't say specifically, the United Nations, everyone has to bring water into everybody's house with a perfect tap. It doesn't say that. But on the other hand, there has to be constant availability. So it's up to the state to determine how they're going to do that. It could be a tap in the village. There are many options for it. But again, it has to meet that idea of constant availability. Okay? Okay. So any questions? So those are the mechanisms. So we have the African Commission, the African Court, and the Commission works to filter cases through the court. In order to get into the Commission, you generally need to exhaust all domestic remedies. Everyone know what I mean by that? Meaning that you can't have a violation and then go directly to the Commission. You have to first try and deal with it in a domestic context. Now, there may be times that people can't because they're geographically distant from local courts, because of corruption, for example. There are ways that people can go directly to the Commission without going through all their remedies because those remedies don't accurately exist. But in most cases in Africa, you have to go through the Commission first. You have to go through your resources, through the Commission, and then in limited cases, you can go to the court. Is that clear? Any questions? No? Okay. Now, any questions? Again, we're not going to go into the tiny little details about the mechanisms, just because I just want to give you a general idea of how it works. The question then is, what are the big issues in Africa? Well, in my opinion, what are the big issues? This is where this is a freedom of expression map. And what we can see here is that the majority of countries in Africa are still listed as not having freedom of expression. Yeah? There are a few that are partly free. Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. There are a few that are free, like Ghana, for example, South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana. But what we can see is that the vast majority of Africa continues to suffer violations, both of freedom of expression and freedom on limitations of press. One of the big consequences, in my opinion, of colonialism, so many years of colonialism, of slavery predating that, was, and then later a Cold War that was fought in many ways in Africa, was the creation of strongman leaders. Yeah, people like everyone know what I mean by strong leader? Dictators is essentially what I'm saying. People like Mugabe in Zimbabwe, Museveni in Uganda, Dos Santos, for example, in Angola. Leaders who have been in power now for 25, 30 years. Some have already left. But the way that they've maintained power was through limitations on freedom of expression. And in an African context, a lot of these issues can be traced back to colonial or post-colonial periods. Many of these leaders, like Sesi Mobutu, who was in Congo, he was one of the most corrupt leaders. He pulled out of that country about $5 billion. Why did he stay in power so long? The United States supported him because they didn't want the Soviets coming to power in the region. Everyone understand what I'm saying here? So because of the Cold War, it wasn't just fought, again, between the Soviets and the United States, sort of about missiles. It was fought actually in Africa. It was sort of a new wave of colonialism. And what happened there were that leaders that were favorable to the United States and to the West, as bad as many of them were, they were supported by the West. And a few bad leaders who were favorable to the Soviets, for example, like Dos Santos in Angola, were supported financially by them. And that was, again, a consequence of many years of colonialism and post-colonialism that fed a culture of human rights violations. The other, I think, big issue that we continue to see in Africa is the issue of torture. As you can see, the majority of countries in violation of the Convention Against Torture have no legislation that criminalizes torture. If we look here, again, this is that have ratified that have ratified CAT, the Convention Against Torture. We can see that many African countries continue not to have ratified the Convention Against Torture. So again, what we can take away from this, I think, is a real understanding that countries lack a real commitment to certain areas, particularly civil and political rights, right? Against torture, against freedom of expression, and those have ultimately bred or have led to, I think, the consolidation of many strongman leaders in sub-Saharan Africa. Another area that I think Africa has really struggled on has been the area of LGBT rights. If we look at most of these countries, gay and lesbian sex is criminalized. In Sudan, for example, the death penalty. Mauritania, death penalty. Somalia, also the death penalty. In most cases, it's punishable by up to about 20 years in prison. Gay and lesbians have struggled. Here, it's not criminalized, no? It is criminalized here as well. Sorry?
Unnatural sex offenses.
Okay, but is it actually prosecuted? Okay. Okay. Okay, but you do see homosexuals often here or no? Are people aren't that open about it?
No, there's a stereotype about it.
Okay, okay.
In the national capital, they protest about it. They make those parades for their rights, but
Yeah.
One case
Oh, what?
Pride parades.
Oh, what?
Pride parades.
Pride, you do have pride parades?
Yeah, this
Okay.
Sunday we have it in Canada.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay. This Saturday, you said?
This Sunday, I guess.
This Sunday. Okay, okay. Interesting, yeah. Okay. So, I mean, it is somewhat out in the open. In the case of Africa time, what's interesting about this is something that's really interesting, but in many countries, this legislation, it either came from Victorian England in some cases. In some cases, though, it's relatively new legislation, particularly the death penalty, for example, that they were talking about in Uganda. And anyone know who has funded a lot of this movement against gays in the United States? I mean, in Africa? United States, interestingly. There are a number of evangelical organizations. If anyone's interested in this, I can send them some material that's been in the New York Times. But there have been a number of organizations, evangelical organizations, particularly in the south of the United States, that have been funding very harsh campaigns against gay and lesbians in Africa. In some ways, it's almost a new wave of colonialization, you know, in this attempt to influence laws concerning the rights of gays and lesbians. Millions of dollars have flowed into the pockets of parliamentarians, of presidents. It's been used as a sort of political issue against, well, many things. Yeah, it's an unfortunate consequence of it. Another issue that I think is particularly important is the issue of prison conditions. This is something that's gotten a lot of attention in Africa. There's actually a special Rapa Tour on prison conditions. This is a photo of how in a prison people sleep at night. They're heavily overcrowded. In a room that's probably half the size of this, you have people sleeping like this. And about every 3 hours, somebody yells, "Turn!" and the people turn. So that way they don't have to sleep in one position. And then in the morning, what they do is, a guy comes in, one of the prisoners, with a big squeegee. You know what a squeegee is? Like to push water. And they clean up all the urine and fecal matter because it's impossible for people to go to the bathroom at night. I mean, the conditions in many African prisons are deplorable. And it's been one of the big focuses of the United Nations, and also, to an extent, the African Commission, which, as I said, has a special rapporteur to focus on prison conditions because they are abominable. The other area is access to justice. One of the big problems in Africa is the limited number of lawyers. If we look, for example, at the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's one lawyer for every 20,000 people. One lawyer for every 20,000 people. Rwanda, one for every 19,000. South Africa, which is the most developed, in terms of human economic and social development, one for every 2,000. Tanzania, one for every almost 50,000. So access to justice is a huge problem, particularly for those that live in rural areas. As I said, 60 to 70% of Africa is still non-urban. Yeah, which in itself tells us something, that most people are geographically isolated, and as a result, access to justice, access to police is extremely, extremely limited. When I was doing some work in Uganda, one of the things was these sex workers work continually. They would try to denounce a case of sexual violence by police. The police would either rape them themselves, they would take their money. There was just very, very limited access to justice and accountability. If we compare it, for example, to Denmark, there's one lawyer for every 247 people. Spain, one for every 314. United States, it's like one for one, practically. In India, too many lawyers also? Too many lawyers. Look how many of you are here, no? So anyway, so access to justice is, I think, one of the big problems, and that's a problem everywhere. But particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's such a limited ratio in terms of access to lawyers and access to legal counsel. Property rights in sub-Saharan Africa for women, we can see that in many areas. Women's property rights are still extremely limited. That is because of old Victorian laws. The same is true for laws protecting women's inheritance rights, for instance, divorce laws. Up until recently, I think it's in Uganda, a woman could only divorce for 3 reasons. If she was, there was sexual violence, infidelity, or physical violence, and she had to wait 2 years from the time that it first happened. A man, on the other hand, could divorce for any cause. Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of inequality in the law. We can see here gender inequality. This is where there's greater gender inequality, and this is where there's particularly poor gender inequality. So we can see that there's really, in very few areas of Africa, is gender equality classified as being pretty good. No? And actually, if we look here, we can see this is an index on gender development, and we can see if we look down at where's sub-Saharan Africa. It's not the worst, but it's not the best. South Asia, which would be here, actually is listed as being worst for overall gender development. I guess here Bangladesh and Pakistan. That would be no, you would qualify as South Asia. Yeah, no, I think it was. It's actually it's a bit lower, and the best being Latin America and the Caribbean. Is that right? It's a little off, but yeah. Anyway, so we can see that the overall gender development it's not the best. But
how do you calculate that index of gender development?
Yeah, so it takes into account basically HDI, which is life expectancy, education, and what am I missing? Life expectancy, education, and what? What is it? Standard of living? No, it's and literacy. Literacy. It's life expectancy, literacy, and what was the other thing I said?
Education.
And education level. Literacy. Literacy, life expectancy. Thank you. No, it's the same. Sorry? Yeah. Oh, I got a biscuit here. Okay. Yeah, it's 3 factors. It's literacy levels, which has a number of, or education levels, which have a number of things. Life expectancy, and then.
Access to employment, it is income.
No, it's not. It's not there. I can check. I forget the third part, but there's 3 elements to it. Yeah.
Per capita income.
Sorry?
Per capita.
Is it per capita? Okay, per capita. Is that what you said? Per capita? Okay, per capita income, exactly. That's exactly right. Okay, gender parity. Again, if we look at Africa, we can see again in terms of school enrollment, we've seen a lot of improvement where parts of Africa have begun to converge. This is particularly so with the Millennium Development Goals, where there's been a big focus on education, and particularly education for females. So we have seen, obviously, starting in about 2000, we see a big upward trend. But we can see that, for instance, Central Africa, which is like Congo and that region, continues to struggle with gender parity in education. Yeah.
The 3 parameters are health, education, and ability to command over economic.
Okay, is that the third one? Okay, thank you for checking. Yeah. Okay, child marriage rates. Africa struggles with very high child marriage rates, which I think in India as well continues to be a problem. Again, it's very much divided based on region, with Central Africa being at about 41%, Southern Africa, which is like Namibia, which has higher development countries, South Africa at about 9%, right? So child marriage across the continent continues to be a problem. Same thing if we look at sexual violence. We can see extremely high rates of sexual violence. For example, in Uganda, Cameroon, Zimbabwe, Equatorial Guinea, for example, there, with, again, lower levels, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and so on. So sexual violence continues to be a particularly big issue, particularly in certain countries. Yeah. Now, I just want to, anyway, I'm just going to do a quick overview of what some of the issues are. I want, though, to show you just one thing. Let me just quickly pull it up. what do you see as maybe problematic?
It is subject to censorship.
Okay. How so?
The article reads, every individual shall have the right to express and disseminate his opinions within the law.
Precisely. Yeah. And that is something that we don't see in other charters. We do see limitations in some cases, and we'll look at it particularly when we do Europe. But what is so problematic about that is that very vague language of within the law. And that's something that we see, for example, everyone shall have the right to free association, provided that he abides by the law. And we see that repeat throughout this charter, this terminology of about the law. And that is something that, in my opinion, is cause for concern, and I think many human rights advocates have also said the same thing, that the charter, although it looks nice and is, we have this African charter, when we actually read through the specifics of it, it has lots of inherent limitations, and mainly this idea that everything has to be within the law. And what law is that? It's the law of the country, right, is what they're referring to. So you have freedom of expression within the law. So if we go back to this example of what I gave before with Uganda, this idea of they can't create an NGO. Why? Because it's not within the law. The law prohibits the creation of, I think the law says, of NGOs that promote immoral activity or something along those lines, which it's not actually doing it, but their argument is, well, this is within the law, right? So that is really, I think, the problem with this charter. Although it expands and enumerates a large number of rights, when you really sort of get down to the details of it, it creates inherent limitations that make the charter, I think, in some ways really in violation of broader human rights. Okay? Any questions about that? No? Okay. How are we doing for time? Is this half an hour? Okay, we have about 25 minutes. I'm going to go a little quick-ish. Everyone following me? Yes? Okay. You go like that. Does that mean yes or no or? Oh, okay. Yes. Sure.
If the limitations is so much, then how can the charter actually do something?
Because in cases involving freedom of expression, and there have been a few that have gone to the commission, they've said basically that the law has not been violates freedom of expression. Do you understand what I mean? So, again, it gives margin to the individual states to do things within the law, but at the same time, it can't be so radical that it violates the law. So we see this. We've seen a number of cases, for example, in Africa, dealing a lot with freedom of press, where there have been, for instance, very heavy fines for defamation, or where there's been even the question where, oftentimes newspapers, the government will say, you've defamed us, and they'll go through the courts, right? Defamation.
So they kind of interpret it in a broader sense.
In a broad sense, yeah. It gives, so the way it's written gives the state a lot of latitude. But in certain cases, not every case, but in certain cases, when it's been interpreted by the commission, they have in some cases said that the state has violated freedom of expression. So it's not absolute, that every case is automatically within the law if it's prescribed by law. Do you understand? But again, the way that it was written, and it was written by the countries themselves, it gives a lot of margin to them. But there have been examples, as I said, where there have been accusations of defamation when there haven't been, for example, where the court or the commission has said what you've done has not been constitutional.
So that means state will decide how much amount of limitation or freedom will be given.
Exactly. We'll see when we talk about in detail tomorrow, when we talk about human rights in Europe, there's a concept of margin of appreciation. Yeah? And that is that states have a certain margin to rule how they want. And it's a similar idea here. It's within the law. That is, they have a margin of what is acceptable within their law. No, but again, it can't be something, and again, we'll see this when we study the cases from Europe, it can't be something that is so clearly a violation. Even if it's within the law, it still can't be in violation of basic principles of freedom of expression. Does that make sense? Yeah. So for instance, I'll give you an example. If there is a law against defamation, right, and I give an opinion that is I believe that Donald Trump, is an idiot. There is something like that, for example, in Africa, could be said to be defamation, right? Whereas the court has interpreted those statements as not being defamatory, right? Because the defamatory has to be a lie, whereas that's opinion. So again, it may be, the law may be defined as defamation, but what actually happened doesn't fit within that. You see what I mean? So it's not everything automatically is within the law. Okay? Okay. The next area that I want to talk about is the Americas. The America extends from South America to Central America, up through North America, which is our neighbor Canada, our friendly neighbor Canada. That makes very good syrup. None of you have tried it. Maple syrup on pancakes? It oftentimes comes from Canada. It's very good. When I was a student in college, I went to school in Vermont, which is right on the border with Canada. And on the weekends, we would always go up to Montreal. It's a fantastic city to do illegal things that we couldn't do in the States. What is the age to drink here? 21.
Depends on the state.
Oh, okay. In the U.S., it's 21 across the board. So when we were 19, we would go to Canada for a weekend. Anyway, okay. So we have two human rights documents in the area of the Americas. One is called the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man, and the second one is the American Convention on Human Rights. This one here has 35 member states that have signed it, which is all of the Americas has signed it. Yeah, and it includes, as I said, civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights, and it's applied by the Inter-American Commission when states have not ratified it. So the main document of Latin America is this, the American Convention on Human Rights. But because not every state has ratified it, if a country hasn't ratified it, the Commission and the Court will apply the American Declaration. Is that clear? Yeah? Sorry? Yeah. So the primary documents in the Americas, this is the American Declaration. As we said with the Universal Declaration, it is a declaration. So arguably, it may not have the same binding status as a convention. But because this was one of the world's earliest human rights treaties, because this has the sign-in, all countries have signed it in the Americas, the court, when a country hasn't signed and ratified this, will apply this. Does everyone understand that? Is that clear? Okay? So this is the convention that gets applied, and then when this can't get applied because a country hasn't, then this goes in.
But what necessitates forming this American Convention on Human Rights when there was a declaration already and signed by 35
Precisely because it was a declaration. So there was questions about its binding status.
That I understand, but since there are issues are being framed which are differently been addressed in this convention, that is why when it is not being put in convention, where a person who the state which is not signatory to this convention will be guided by the declaration itself.
Yes. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
That is the point.
Yeah.
When the declaration was already there, just to make when it is already, even it is not binding by the signatory authority, being a convention. What was the what necessitates for and what how it differs from the declaration?
So okay, so this here, first of all, this along with other documents, it has a much stronger focus, for instance, on democracy, and a much stronger focus, for example, on the elimination of torture and other related activities. What necessitated this was the country was Latin America's largely history with dictatorships. This was signed early on, before the dictatorships really, during the 60s and 70s and 80s, entered into power. So once that began to fade, to demonstrate a greater commitment to human rights, because this was seen as only a declaration, they created the American Convention as a way of giving more strength to human rights and placing a greater focus on many of the rights issues that were violated during the dictatorships. Does that answer your question? Sort of? Yes? Okay. In addition to that, we also have a number of other documents. And as you can see, these documents specifically reflect the broad range of issues in Latin America. The Inter-American Convention on to Prevent and Punish Torture. Additional Protocol on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So even though this convention mentioned the right to development and so forth, this one here goes further. It has a strong focus, again, on cultural rights. It has a strong focus on work rights, for example, etc. Yep. There's also the protocol to the American Convention to abolish the death penalty. I think the United States is the only country in the Americas that still has the death penalty. The Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women. Latin America has one of the highest rates of gender violence and femicide in the world. The American Convention on Forced Disappearance. And then the American Convention on, again, all forms of discrimination against persons with disabilities. As you can see here, there's a strong effort by the Inter-American community to deal with questions very much linked to dictatorships. Everyone understand that? Yeah. And again, that is really largely based on history. Before that, we only had the Declaration, which was very similar to, we could say, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But post-dictatorship, or towards the end, there was a need in some ways to compensate for the very sort of vague and limited information that was contained in the Declaration. And secondly, to try and remedy many of the problems that occurred during the dictatorships ranging from Honduras to Argentina to Chile and so on. Yeah? Good? Questions? No? Okay. Oh yeah, then we also have the Inter-American Convention Against Racism and Racial Discrimination, Discrimination and Intolerance, Freedom of Expression, and then Persons Deprived of Liberty. So we still have quite a number of conventions in place. Now, we have, similar to Africa, we have two mechanisms. One is the Inter-American Commission, which is based in Washington, D.C., even though the United States is not a part of it. They've signed, but they haven't ratified it. Yeah. And the concept there is pro himine interpretation. Basically means the interpretation always has to be in support of the human, is basically what it is. Everyone understand there? That whatever interpretation of the law is, it always has to be most favorable to the human being, right? That's sort of their guiding principle. And similar to the other mechanisms that we've seen, again, individual complaints, it can hear complaints in a non-binding forum, monitoring through Rapa Tours and so on, and then identifying and addressing thematic areas. Monitoring being through committee reviews, and then identifying and addressing thematic areas through Rapa Tour processes. Everyone understand that? I'm not going to go through each one because we've talked about it, right? But it's basically the same as what we've seen. It's modeled off of similar to the United Nations, right? And then we have the Inter-American Court. Again, similar to the African system, complaints enter here, and then on appeal, or if there's non-compliance, they can go to the Inter-American Court, yeah? And again, it hears non-compliance, contentious issues from the Commission. That is that if an individual is not content with the outcome of the Commission, they can appeal to the court, yeah? And it also issues advisory opinions, yeah? Same idea, that a state can consult it on some sort of advisory question. Now, what can the court do? The court can issue certain reparations. Apart from monetary reparations, it can also issue, for example, public apologies by the state, training of public officials, medical and psychological care, legislative reform. It can annul criminal convictions. It can even provide, in some cases, a few cases, scholarships for victims' education, construction of monuments, and other forms of commemoration. So what we've seen come out of the court has been much more effective. Some of the best jurisprudence that we have in human rights has come from the Inter-American Court. It has outstanding scholars, and even though it doesn't have as many cases as the European Court of Human Rights, which we'll talk about more likely, I think, tomorrow, nevertheless, it's in its history, it's offered quite a wide range of human rights reparations. Okay. If we look at the number of cases that have gone through the commission, again, we can see, it's a little hard to see here, but over the last few years, per year, it gets about 2,000 complaints. But the problem here is if we look at it, you can't really see it. It received last year 2,000, but the number of cases it still has pending before the commission is 9,000. So one of the big problems with the commission has been the lack of resources. It's not as underfunded as the African system, although the African system gets fewer cases. This gets a lot of cases. But nevertheless, it still has a huge backlog of cases that still haven't had initial review. 9,000 is the initial review phase. So it's one of the big limitations of the court is that it doesn't have the resources to hear as many complaints. One of the things that we can say about the Inter-American Court is that it's much better promoted, it's much more supported by individual member states. As lawyers are better trained to bring cases to the commission, individuals are more informed by it. The consequence of that is that there are many cases that go to the commission and there's not enough economic resources or human capital to meet all those cases. Yeah. Now, I want to take a look at what are some of the big human rights issues in the Americas. The first is, and this is one of the big issues, actually in Spain as well, the historical past. That is, under the Convention on Torture, under the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, one of the big focuses is on this idea of access to justice for victims of torture. And there's a lot of questions that exist over what do we do about the memories of these people? How can families, particularly mothers of the disappeared as they're called, get reparations for the loss of their children? Yeah? And get answers, not just money, but information. It's one of the big things lacking. If we look at the history of the Americas, we can see starting in the late 1800s, a big history of dictators. Yeah, but no, I mean you can see that again up through. We have people like, for example, have people heard of Pinochet, for example? Manuel Noriega, for instance. I think it was Panama. Pinochet, for instance. Raúl Castro, who's still in power. There's been a long history of dictatorships in the Americas, and although many of them are dying out, and there is a greater focus on the historical past, the convention obligates states to deal with torture. Right? It becomes a human rights violation when states seek to hide information, when they fail to compensate families and victims of torture. So there's a big focus now on this idea of reparations and historic memory. How do we deal with the past? Yeah. And the worst dictator of them all. The other big issue is the question of indigenous and minority rights. One of the big criticisms of the Inter-American Convention is there's not a specific focus on indigenous rights. There is an Inter-American Convention on racial discrimination, but it doesn't specifically talk about the rights of indigenous populations. And there's not a specific convention on indigenous populations. If we look at it, 12% of the Americas, about 40 million people are classified as indigenous in Latin America and the Caribbean. 12% of the Americas, 12% of the Americas is indigenous, and 40% of them live in rural areas. And as a result of that, lack of access to justice, very limited political representation, increasingly they're moving into urban areas, but oftentimes they lack resources. And one of the big issues that indigenous people face in Latin America is resource extraction. Yeah, that is the taking of resource, the taking of their land for oil, for wood, without any form of due process or any form of consideration or input on their part. So indigenous rights is really one of the biggest issues. Gender violence. There's an estimate that about 40% of women in Latin America have been subject to gender violence. 44% of women in Colombia. In Peru, that figure rises to 47%. And my guess that figure is underreported. Now it's probably close to 50%. We also have a high level of femicide. Have people heard of that term, femicide? Genocide, but the killing of... Sorry? What do you call it? What?
Femicide would be women.
Femicide is women, yeah. Genocide, but the killing of women, right? Femicide. And 14 out of the 25 countries in the world that have high levels of femicide are in Latin America. So one of the big issues facing that is inequality. And if we look at, this is from a little outdated, but if we look at Latin America, actually here, it has quite a low level of gender equality. We can see it's at about 4.4, so it's relatively low. Yeah, not the worst. The Arab countries, oh no, Sub-Saharan Africa is worst, but it is quite high. Freedom of expression, I think, in many ways is really quite good in Latin America, with a few exceptions. For example, Venezuela and Colombia there. But overall, freedom of expression has improved a lot. And in many ways, this has been post-dictatorship. There's been a real sort of focus on democracy building and commitment to freedom of expression. It's not by any means perfect, but we can see in this chart, which is by Freedom House, it's one of sort of the major reference on freedom of expression. It's along, India is there as well, Australia, most of this part of America, although Mexico and Central America continues to struggle, and then the United States and Canada. So freedom of expression has been relatively good in the Americas. And in many ways, again, it's a commitment post-dictatorship to rule of law and democracy building in those regions. Now, if we go to the United States, I want to focus a little bit on the United States, although I'm wondering if maybe we should leave it for tomorrow, because there's a lot to say. We only have 5 minutes. I think I'm going to leave this for tomorrow. Is that okay? Sorry? Yeah. Tomorrow it makes sense, because we're going to do the United States and Europe. So let me just to very quickly, because I don't want to abuse you. I mean, not abuse you physically, but I don't want to take advantage of your kindness. So basically today, hopefully what you got out of today was, first of all, an overview of the United Nations and how it functions. There's lots to talk about with the United Nations, lots to criticize, lots to applaud, but we can say that the United Nations functions in some respects, but it is limited by certain, just give me a second, by certain structural issues. I think although many of us, particularly you young people, it's important to be idealistic and to say human rights, but we also have to acknowledge that there are structural institutional limitations in the United Nations that make it, in some ways, ineffective, in other ways, effective. The second thing to take away from today's class is how the processes work. Hopefully from this committee review process, you can get a general idea of how they review states. And then finally, you got an idea of, in Africa, what are the general mechanisms that are used, and what are the big human rights problems. And then also in the Americas, what are the primary mechanisms in the Americas? And secondly, what are some of the big human rights problems? Tomorrow what we'll focus on in the beginning of class is the United States. What are the big human rights violations in the United States? And then secondly, what are the European mechanisms, and what are the big violations in Europe? What I'd like you to read for tomorrow is the jurisprudence under freedom of expression. Okay? So you need to read, I'll just tell you, you don't need to read all the cases. You need to read Brandenburg versus Ohio, Virginia v. Black, Norwood versus the UK, Peter versus Deutschland, and then on the bottom, New York Times versus Sullivan, and then Barthold versus Germany. If you would like, I think it would be helpful if you just go on Google these. Yeah, Brandenburg versus Ohio, Virginia v. Black, Norwood versus UK, Peter versus Deutschland. Deutschland is Germany. New York Times versus Sullivan, and then Barthold versus Germany. Do the best you can. I know it's a lot. If you can't read everything, I'll lecture on it anyway. So again, I think it'll help you in the class. But yeah, I realize you can't read everything. And then there are also some news articles. If you have time, Google them. They're quite short, and they give you a nice overview of the issues. Okay. Any questions about anything? Okay, good. Hopefully, again, today's been productive for you. Any questions, any problems, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to talk with you. And have a good Friday night. Okay, good. See you
No, the
tomorrow.
students, please be wait. Please